Rest in peace here. I think we're a minute early. This is new. I don't remember having to use this before, but it's here. It probably helps some of you better, so I'm glad to have that. We're in the class, What Does That Mean? If I'm doing my math right, we've only got a few of these classes left this week, next week, and then the 26th. And the most difficult part of this has been to try to whittle down and to cover all the subjects that one would want to in a class like this. And today I'm going to talk about something that affects our life each and every day. It seems like a lot of the words that we are addressing deal with those matters on the divine side, that is, things that God does. A lot of our words have been about redemption. The word this week is going to really encapsulate everything, every moment of every one of our lives, no matter who we are. And what's incredible about that is that's true if you happen not to be a New Testament Christian or if you are. Now, it impacts you differently, and I believe God works differently depending on that state or status that you find yourself in. And what I'm talking about is providence. And when we think about the subject of providence, I just want you for a moment to think about, and I know I've already talked to several of you, you think about what's going on in our lives in the last 96 hours. I don't know how far you want to pan out, maybe the last 2 weeks. And I want you to think about the circumstances that had happened in your life. Are you persuaded that God's providence has been a part of each and every one of those? Okay? So before we speak more specifically about that, I think the place for us to begin is, as we should always, is to try to get a handle on what the word means. Because that is what this class is about, is what does that mean? And so if you were to try to explain to somebody else what providence means, what would you say? How would you explain it? How would you define it? Okay, all right. So I think you would have to, right, in defining this word, is to speak of provision. And in order to do so, to understand it from a biblical framework, that God is the one who has provided. Okay, I certainly think you can't define providence without that principle. Is that all it is that God provides? Is that providence in a nutshell? Well, let me ask it this way. How would you further define it in the life of a person to help them understand? If this will help, as you think about that, what's the difference between the providence of God and the miraculous operation of God? Is providence miraculous? Perhaps, though it's not going to be the focus of our study today, it would be good for us to define what a miracle is. What's a miracle? Okay, Rhonda says it's supernatural, and she is absolutely right. Let me ask you a question, though. Is providence supernatural?
Maybe.
Supernatural. Natural points to what? Nature, the ongoing operation of the world. What would super indicate? Something beyond just mere chance and events and happenstance. Great definition, but it needs clarification. What else is a miracle besides a supernatural act? Because I would suggest to you that providence is also supernatural. Front to back, or we can't really fully understand providence. What else would you say about a miracle that distinguishes it from providence?
It seems to me that miracle, at least the ones we read about in the Bible, were noticeable at the time they occurred. To me, providence is something you may not realize it's happened until you look back and see what's happened.
Okay, all right. So it's noticeable at time if somebody is missing a limb and it's restored. You see that it is, so that helps us get closer in that. Often with providence, you need retrospect. Any single event in providence can seem like it's just a matter of course. It's just something that incidentally happened. We'll talk about that toward the end of our class. Okay, are you satisfied with this definition?
I think also a miracle defies the laws of nature.
Okay, all right. So defies, if I can say it just a little bit differently, it overturns the law of nature. Okay, so it is God stepping in and disrupting the natural flow of something, raising the dead, healing the sick with a touch. Remember, everybody who comes within Paul's shadow of Peter, that proximity, the woman with an issue of blood, and she touches Jesus and power comes out of him. And so that's an overturning of the law of nature. Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee and there's a storm and they're afraid they're going to die. And he says, peace, be still. And suddenly it stops right there.
Neil?
Yeah.
The apologist in me won't live with that one. He can feed a new event in, but still use the laws of nature. I think that's important. Like he can cause something to go out of order, if you will, but then the laws of nature can take over as well. So he can still use the laws. It's an
You're talking about providence now.
Wait, no, in a miracle.
In a miracle.
He can take a new event, feed it into an existing law of nature.
Okay.
That way, because that.
So give me an example of what you're talking about.
All sorts of things, he could do something that make a cloud show up, and then the shadows from that could cause all sorts of things. He could do something, and then the weather takes over, like the normal events that cause weather to happen. He could feed a precursor event into that.
Okay.
And allow the laws of nature or weather to take over.
So two things there. Sometimes that can be just providential, right?
Exactly, right.
And sometimes what we're going to find, and I'm going to hold this as an example, we see a mixture in the Bible when God performed it in a miraculous way, where God may use a miracle in an event that's filled with providence. Providence existed in biblical times. Providence exists today. Miracles in the sense that we read about them in the Bible. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 8 through 10, as signs to confirm that the Word of God is from Christ and not from some other source. The utilizing the laws of nature in a way, because miracles always had a purpose. The miracles were always pointing to the identity of God and Christ in a way that confirmed the word that was being spoken. And so Landon is right. There are times where those two can dovetail, but there has to be a distinction that occurs at some point when the miracle occurs. Something has changed with the law of nature, even if you work through that. Good thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
I feel like sometimes providence can be written off as coincidence, whereas a miracle is pretty obvious that can't be explained away.
Yeah. So, as we're going to see when we get to the heart of... I know it ends dental. That's pretty close. All right, so seems chancy. All right, so but taken together, we can look back over that and we can see the hand of God working through those events. All right, anything else you want to add to the definition of providence or miracle? All right, let me help you with some of the definitions that I found, and then I'm going to kind of narrow this down. You never know when you put it up. Can y'all see that okay? All right, okay. Providence is the means by which God directs all things, animate and inanimate, seen and unseen, good and evil, toward a worthy purpose, which means that His will must ultimately prevail. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in that. It's the means by which God directs all things. It doesn't mean that He takes the handle and He makes something happen contrary to the will of an individual. He is working through, He's directing, and yet He is still in control, and His will must ultimately prevail. And we'll talk about how that works along with our free will as we go forward. Merrill Unger says, providence is the continual care God exercises over the universe that He has created. The providence of God is unlimited. But we're going to see that there's a difference between general providence and special providence. So if you look at those two words as a contrast to each other, what do you think general providence is?
Everyday.
Somebody said every day.
Nature,
Okay.
natural routine.
The broad across a wide spectrum. So let's think in terms of special providence.
Maybe an answer to a unique prayer.
Okay, I think that would be an example of that. But special providence is providence in your life. So here's the question. Does God work His providence over all mankind? For an example. Does God work providence in your specific life? Yes. The difference between... Do you have to be a believer to enjoy God's general providence? No. But is there a special... Now, can God work His special providence in the life of an unsaved person?
Yes.
Do you think that He does? To what end?
Salvation.
For salvation? Out of goodness? And we'll talk about all of that. What's the goal of providence, do you think? It's simple.
God's will.
God's will. It's to fulfill His purpose. Right? So He, with the perspective that He has, is omniscient. That is, He knows all things. He is everywhere all at once. And He is unlimited in His power. And He is working that across, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, all the different spheres in which events are taking place on an ongoing basis. The particular steps of the divine process of providence are often impossible for us to understand, but His purpose is independent, and it's eternal, and it will certainly come to pass. And to the degree that we believe in providence, it causes us to live a life of trust and gratitude and patience and hope. Because the contrast to that is that God has left us in this world all alone, and He is not at work in the events that are taking place every day, which, for example, makes prayer completely meaningless. If God is detached and is not at work in order to accomplish His will, which we're seeking to influence through prayer, as an example. Now, where do we read about providence in Scripture?
Joseph, Esther, Abraham.
Okay, so the word providence, is it there? So we do come close. What do we see? What word do we see a lot? Provide. Can you think of an example where someone is recognizing the providence of God and says almost as much? Genesis 22. All right, so we have Abraham being told to offer up Isaac. And you remember the going up the mountain? And what's Isaac's question? Where's the lamb? What does Abraham say? God will provide. And you go to Genesis 22 and verse 14. What does he even call? He renames the place. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. So what he is seeing is now certainly God's intervention. So it's the concept of God providing. Now, in that circumstance, are there miraculous elements in Genesis 22? What are they?
The stopping of the...
When's the last time God said, hey, Tim, I want you to go out here today and I want you to go and do this X, Y, or Z? So that's God intervening in a way. God speaks to us through His Word. He's not giving us a vision or speaking to us. And you remember when Abraham is about to take the life of Isaac, what happens next?
God verbally stopped.
The angel of the Lord speaks from heaven and says, don't do this. I know that you believe in me because you would not withhold your son, your only son, from me. And then, now, there's a lamb in the thicket behind him. Miraculous? Necessarily? Could that lamb have just been walking through the thicket at that time? Wait a minute. You're telling me that has to be miraculous, that animal could not have just at that moment gotten caught in the thicket. Abraham hears a rustling, turns around, and there is the ram. Has that ever happened in your life at a moment when something needed to be done? And do you think that was a miracle, or was it the providence of God? Working through time and events and people to accomplish His will. Is it possible that God stuck that ram in that thicket at that moment in a miraculous way? Maybe He spontaneously generated him and put him right there? Certainly. But is it not just even I would say even more probable that through providence God provided the lamb?
That lamb might have been wandering for 3 or 4 days.
And just at that moment. Hey, here's the thing about providence. Did God know? Can God size up the time and the event so that they work together in coordination? Could you do that? No. Could God do that? Yes. And I want us to see, when we talk about providence, that God is at work. And God is at work in real time through the events that happen to you and me every day. Through the people that come into our lives. God knows in His foreknowledge. He doesn't make it happen. He knows the things that are going to be and the people that are going to come into our lives. And He is at work, not just doing that in your life, but in 8 billion plus people all over the planet because of the infiniteness of God. Let me give you another definition, then we'll move on to some of the spheres in which God's providence is found. Providence carries the idea of foresight. God seeing before time. But also God's preserving. That is, His saving. And His governing. That is, His making things happen. All things by means of a second cause. The second cause is through His creation. Through the created order. Through the world. So we'll say more about Esther in just a moment. I appreciate Bobby bringing those up. But I want to tell you up front that I don't know that I can tell you what events are and are not providence in your life. I think we should be very careful about automatically ascribing that. I think we can trust in the principle of providence without speaking in God's place. And one reason I would say that is in Philemon, verse 15 and 16, you have the Apostle Paul who is appealing to Philemon, the recipient of his letter, about Onesimus, his runaway slave. And the inspired writer Paul, in speaking to Philemon about this situation, says, "Who knows but that he was separated from you for a time so that you could receive him back not as a slave, but as a brother." A Spirit-led writer can't say definitively that this is providence. And so that's just the humility, I think, that we should bring to this. And when we say that we can trace providence in the life of Esther, we're going to see later on that Mordecai couldn't look at a single event and say with confidence that this is providence and this is not. So instead, what does he say to Esther? In the most recognizable passage in Esther, Esther 4:14.
Who knows?
Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? But when we live our lives trusting that God is involved and at work in our lives, then we know He is. Even if we can't look at individual events. And I appreciate, I think it was Brittany that said this a moment ago, even the things that seem coincidental, over the tapestry of time, we can look back and we can see it. All right, so just as a means of us seeing what the Bible does have to say, I want us to look at the spheres of providence. Where is God exerting His providence in the totality of life? The Bible has a lot to say about that. For example, the Bible tells us that God is exerting His providence in the natural world. And when we talk about that, we look in two directions. God is directing His providence in the universe. So we talk about a 30,000 foot view. Let's pan all the way out. And let's think about God's providence in the entire universe. Bible writers tell us that God is at work in governing and preserving through His will, the exertion of His will. Psalm 103 and verse 19 says it this way. The Lord has established His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom rules over all. All right, Nebuchadnezzar, in his moment of clarity, you remember when he's humbled by God and he is made to walk, to crawl around like a beast for a time. In Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35, he says, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. And He does, according to His will, among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can stay His hand or say to Him, what have you done? So Nebuchadnezzar has a recognition that God is uninhibited in acting upon creation in the way that works with His overall will. Now, this comes into the character and the nature of God. God is not a mean or a despotic God. And so we can trust that one of the principles of providence is that God's always seeking to work for good. He is not doing anything that could be judged on any level as mean or unfair or unrighteous. Okay? Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 11 says it this way: In Him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will. What does that mean? It means He works all things according to what He has purposed, according to His will, which is without any chink or any kind of less than perfect approach to each individual situation. It extends to the physical world, this providence over the natural world. Job, it's actually Elihu in Job chapter 37 and verse 10 who says, By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. That's part of the providential working of God. The psalmist says it in Psalm 104 and verse 14. He says, You cause the grass to grow. Have you thought about that as being part of the providence of God? Did you think about that when you were on your lawnmower this weekend? But, listen, he says, You cause the grass to grow for the livestock. Aren't you grateful for that? Because that perpetuates life and we ultimately get the benefit of that. And you cause the grass to grow for the plants for man to cultivate. Y'all get your garden in yet? You see that, and do you rely upon the providence of God in that? That He may bring forth food from the earth. So why is God working His providence in the natural world? For the grass and the seed. The provide, the supply for us. And a few verses later, Psalm 104 and verse 16. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly. The cedars of Lebanon that He planted. A couple of chapters later, in Psalm 135, verse 6 and 7, Whatever the Lord pleases, He does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all the deeps. He it is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightning for the rain, and brings forth wind from His storehouses. And so here is God in all the domain that is His power, working all of these things simultaneously for the good of the entire natural world. When we think about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, He speaks of the providence of God in multiple ways, right? What's the one that comes to your mind probably the most in God's providence for everybody? What does God do no matter how good or bad you are? Rain and sun. Matthew 5:45. Now let's drill it down. Matthew 6 and verse 30. God clothes the grass of the field, and He'll clothe you. All right, so He's referencing providence as an illustration of the point. All right, so then there's also the animal kingdom. The young lions, Psalm 104, verse 21 and 28. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. Verse 28, when you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. And so God is taking care of, with all else God has to do with the 8 billion of us, and how many ever of us are Christians through whom He's working His special providence. How attentive is God to the animal kingdom? Do you remember what He says? Jesus in His ministry, Matthew 10, verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, for a cent? And yet not one of them falls from heaven without your Father's attention. That is how minutely God is focused on the animal world. And then there's national affairs. God's providence is seen in national affairs. In Job 12, Job says in Job 12:23, He makes nations great and He destroys them. He enlarges them and He leads them away. Do you see the providence of God in the events of nations? I mean, you think about how much nations right now are in the news. So how do we interpret that? Yes, sir.
The thing that comes to my mind is He working providence every day looking at all these things you're talking about? Or is this part of His divine providence from the very creation where He made nature to work this way and we know that we can plant and there's a good chance it's going to come out?
In Genesis 9, He says, seed time and harvest, summer and winter will continue. So there's a providence He set in place naturally.
From the very beginning.
Yes. Absolutely. So here's the question. Can we pray for rain? Is it possible that God will hear our prayer for rain? Can we influence or change His will through prayer? If not, why would we do that? Certainly it raises our dependency. But see, both of those things can be true. God has a plan that He set in motion from the beginning, and we still petition Him for help in those things. That's a great point. All right. Acts 17:26. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So, we may see unfairness in events. I don't know what your perspective is. And this, I think I can say this and be apolitical. But I think it is. I've done mission work in Ukraine. I talked at Lads to Leaders to a fellow I met on my first mission trip. His parents have been converted to Christ, and they live in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And he said, you know what the consequences are if this war ends right now and we just have a stalemate in this land that has been taken by the Russians, it remains in the hands of the Russians. Do you know what that means for the church? Because now no longer is the church that his parents are a member of in the country of Ukraine. It's now in the country of Russia. And the freedom to worship and the liberties that they enjoy as Ukrainians are not there for them in Russia. How do we jive that with the providence of God? If God is working in the affairs of nations, is He falling down on the job? We speak reverently and don't believe that the answer to that is yes.
Eisenhower biographer Stephen Ambrose gave the providence of God as the answer to the weather breaking on June 5th, 1944, when General Eisenhower had to say go for D-Day, or it wouldn't have happened.
Okay.
The weather broke. Eisenhower didn't have Chris Allen or Steve Cantori to consult.
Yeah.
He had only God to consult.
Yeah. And there are moments in history where we're looking through that. Did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, well, those Christians, if they're not allowed to worship publicly anymore, may just go underground and it may spread even farther, the Christian faith.
That's the answer. We look at this from a physical standpoint without the dimension of the spiritual. None of us are asking God, please bring such governmental, foreign, or whatever oppression on us that it becomes illegal to be a Christian in the United States of America. Not one of us wants that. But if it happened, would it be the end of the church?
No.
How do we know that? Read the book of Acts. And see how the church oppressed. Read 1 Peter. And so that's something that's going to happen in the study of providence is we've got to retool our view of the world and see that God is sovereign and that He is at work. But a lot of times what we think that means is it works for my good and that I have a greater comfort and I have a greater joy. But it may not be that, and yet we know that if we work in cooperation with the will and the purpose of God, that even if we're driven underground, that may mean more souls are saved on the judgment day than otherwise. I know that Victor's parents don't want that. I don't want it for them. But I trust the providence of God that whatever happens, that His will be done and it won't be thwarted. That's what Job says in Job 42, verse 1 and 2. Perhaps the most important discovery Job made in all of his suffering. He says, I know you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted.
Neil,
Yes?
we overlook, He told us we're going to be persecuted, so we shouldn't be surprised when those things happen. It's another part of His overall plan.
Yep. You want to write down in your notes there, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12. All that live godly will suffer persecution. Peter says, what do you want it now or then? So it's not, again, it's not something, I don't know, have you prayed? God, please send us persecution. I don't think I've reached that level of spiritual maturity in my prayer life, but I do say your will be done, whatever causes your kingdom to grow, and that may be how that is answered in certain situations. God not bringing good, but knowing the evil that men do, working through that to accomplish His purpose. And that's something that is also, if we get that far, is what we'll talk about. All right, how about in individual lives? Do you see God's providence at work in individual lives in the Bible? Can you think of an example in an individual life where God's providence was at work? Okay, Esther and Joseph. Hang on to those. We'll look at those more closely. You remember when Saul was rejected? 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 1, God says to Samuel concerning Jesse's children, He said, I have provided for myself a king among his sons. How specific was that providence? A specific son. All right? Then we have that man writing in Psalm 139 and verse 16, Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. If we assume correctly that that's not miraculous, that's the providential working of God, is that true of you?
Yeah.
Could you say in the first person as he did, your eyes saw my unformed substance? You wrote down every day of my life, even before there was a one of them. Does that require a miraculous overturning of the laws of nature? Not at all. How about this? Jeremiah 1 and verse 5. God says to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And while you're chewing on that one, Galatians 1, 15 and 16, but when He who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by His grace was pleased to reveal His Son to me. This is Paul. When was God pleased to reveal His Son in him? On the road to Damascus. In order that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. If God had chosen to write your story in Scripture, do you believe that He could say the same thing about your life? No, not that you were a prophet appointed to the nations, but whatever the X, Y, and Z is of your life, that He could say, if you're living in accordance with the will of God, that He saw that before you were born and worked toward that end. He put you in this position. He put you in Bowling Green in the United States of America in the 21st century for the set of opportunities that He wants you to take advantage of in order to help His kingdom to be strengthened and to grow. When you're down, when you're not feeling that great about yourself, will you remember that perspective, the divine perspective on your life? Now, we talked about predestination. Does that mean that God foreordains the outcome, the decision that you're going to make? That He determines that you're going to be faithful and you're going to do those things? Is that inherent in the verses that we just cited? In Jeremiah 1:5, you know why Jeremiah 1:5 is in the Bible? What if Jeremiah said, no thanks, I'm going to live the comfortable life, I'm going to be just like everybody else, and I'm going to say peace, peace when there is no peace. When I hear walking the old paths, I'm going to say, nope, I'm not going to do it. Would we have that preserved in Scripture? How about if the Apostle Paul, blind as he was on the road to Damascus, said, if I have to do it blind, I'm still going to go hunt down Christians. I'm going to put them to death. If he had said, I know, but I'm not going to do it. Would Galatians 1:15 and 16 be in the Bible? It's because they consented with and agreed with and worked with the providence of God, that God has that preserved in Scripture. So God can have in mind for you to reach out and to save a soul. And you can choose not to work in concert with that. He could desire for you and work through you if you become a child of God in ways that touch lives that we won't know till eternity. But only if you agree with and work with the will that He has for you. Thoughts or comments?
Jeremiah 10:23.
Mm-hmm.
O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps.
That's it. Yeah.
Who's going to direct them if it's not me?
That's right. It's God. God's directing the steps, and I can choose whether I'm going to follow them or not. That's good. All right, let me hit a couple other things here because I haven't gotten to the examples yet. There's the free will actions of man, and all I'll say about that is that God can permit sinful actions, and He can even take them, and He can bring good out of them. He doesn't cause sin. He doesn't approve of sin, but He can limit sin. He can restrain sin, and He can overrule sin for his good. Let's take maybe an opposite of what Roger talked about when the skies cleared on June 5th, 1944. What about in circumstances, we may not know until the Judgment Day, when Germany tried to invade Russia in World War II, and they tried to start, and people died in that, but they weren't able. They extended themselves too far. Is it possible that God restrained? He kept. 2 Thessalonians says God restrains. He keeps something from happening that the forces of evil would strive to do. So God's not going to allow people to step beyond where He will, so He can work through providence to keep that from taking place.
But it's hard though. You know, when you see those things, first off, you know, here, part of it, we don't know.
Yeah.
You mentioned that up front, but it's hard to sit here and wonder about when bad things happen. The Holocaust,
Yeah.
COVID. You know, how could good things, as much damage as COVID did, for example, to the church, those are things that are just hard for me.
Yep. Two things I think we have to say in response to that is again, to refine our perspective from the spiritual and try to see it as He does. To understand that whenever difficulty comes, be it persecution, be it natural disaster, be it oppression, that there are always casualties, and the guilty will pay the punishment for that. In the Holocaust, though innocent lives were taken, the guilty are going to pay the price for what they have done. When we say what good came out of the Holocaust, again, God didn't cause that.
No.
You know, as I say, God can take.
Strength in the faith came out of that.
That's right. You know, if it's not anything more than a reminder.
Right.
But again, it's a refining of our perspective to see it through spiritual eyes. But you're right.
It's hard.
It's hard. And I don't want to offset the fact that it is hard.
Well, like COVID, you know, I hate for those souls that fell away. But I feel like the church got stronger after that.
Right.
The people that stayed behind seem to be a lot more committed and devoted.
Yeah. Yeah, in any time of any kind of suffering, it can be a refining. And it's retooling our perspective. And providence plays a role in that. But I appreciate the reality of that comment. It is hard. And we do well to acknowledge that. Yes, sir.
I think a great example of that last one you put up would be Jonah. There was a lot of people affected. God, His free will sent him on the wrong way. And God intervened.
Mm-hmm.
And it affected everybody on the ship, and it affected the whole country of Nineveh,
Yeah.
the city of Nineveh.
And it was grace defined as undeserved, mercy and forgiveness. Jonah's being swallowed by that fish was a display of grace. Gave him another chance to do what was right. And even though he kicked and screamed the whole way, God still worked through that to save the Ninevites for 150 more years. Who knows how many people ultimately are saved as the result of that. All right, so let's kind of that's a good transition point. There's God's innate goodness and God's innate justice that are spheres of His providence. His innate goodness, that is, goodness that describes and defines Him, is seen in answered prayers. In Psalm 68 and verse 10, in your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. Isaiah 64 and verse 4, from of old no one has heard or perceived by the ear, no eye has seen a God besides you, who acts for those who wait for Him. Matthew 6 and verse 8, your Father knows what you need before you even ask. And yet, in that, He wants you to ask and to seek His kingdom first, and all these things will be added to you. Verse 33. His innate justice, He punishes the disobedient. We can trust that. You think about the oppressors that we've talked about, whether it's in the Holocaust or in Russia or wherever it is. Psalm 7 says, God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day. Does He punish every day? Let's say a nation is going to fall. It may be 20 years from now. But I'm focusing in here. It says that God is indignant every day about what's taking place. If a man does not repent, God will whet His sword. He has bent and readied His bow. He has prepared for him His deadly weapons, making his arrows fiery shafts. What we want so often is for God to act the way we want Him to act, when we want Him to act, not knowing that He has the benefit of the overarching view of everything and is working through time and events on the scale that we've just talked about to accomplish His purpose in this world. And I can trust that when I look into my individual life. If Proverbs 14:34 is true, righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people, how does God carry this out? We need to be very careful for crediting God for doing this when it may be simply natural disasters as a part of a fallen world. But we do take note that God has operated that way in human history through providence. And so, as we think about where God's providence is seen, the Bible tells us all over the place. And just very quickly, there are biblical teachings about providence that show us that God is working through time and events in people in order to accomplish His will in our lives. Hebrews 1:3 says, He upholds all things by the word of His power. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 17 says, He is before all things, and by Him all things hold together. In the redemption plan, Galatians 4 and verse 4, in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem those who were under the curse of the law. Philemon 15 and 16, we've already mentioned that. And then the one perhaps that comes to your mind the most, we know that all things work together for good, them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. The Bible teaches that God coordinates events in order to bring about specific desired outcomes. Now, these passages kind of fall under the umbrella of special providence, God working in the lives of individuals in order to accomplish His will. But we also see that God's working through general providence in passages like Matthew 5:45. Or Acts 14, 16 and 17. He sends rain for food and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with gladness. Acts 17:25. He lives and moves and gives us our very being. So we see God's providence is taught very plainly. But the best way that we can see providence is by examples. And for the sake of time, I want to make sure we get this one. There's Esther. So we think about how the providence of God is seen. By the way, what's one of the distinctive things about the book of Esther among all the books of the Bible? No mention of the name of God at all. And yet, I don't know that there is a book of the Bible that more clearly, from front to back, shows the continuous working of God than in the book of Esther. So, how do we see providence in the book of Esther? So, first of all, the king who is on the throne at this time is Xerxes. And he fights in the largest battle, the largest army on the continent of Europe. And the events in Esther occur after that battle, most likely. He was a king over 120 provinces. You can read that in Esther chapter 1. And within that dominion, at that time, all the Jews lived. Okay, so just file that fact away. All the Jews are under the dominion and under the control of Xerxes. He can do with them what he wants to do. And so when you read the book of Esther, things that you look at individually, you might say, was luck. When you take them together, it makes up an unmistakable working of providence. So, how does it begin? Vashti, you remember? What does she do? She refuses to dance, as he says, and as a result of this, what happens to Vashti? She's gone. So what has to happen now? For a king has to have one, a queen. All right, so there's a beauty contest, and that's how Esther begins. Now, where does Esther wind up? Before she becomes the queen.
She has to have all the beauty treatments?
So you have this huge list, just like in a beauty contest, you have this huge list of contestants. She so happens to go into the care of a eunuch named Higai. And Higai likes her. He appreciates things about her. And so he makes her favorable, and he gives her special insider tips on how that she can be favorable to King Xerxes. And as a result, she's put in the best place in the harem, and she finds favor in the eyes of all the people who come to know her. She is being Esther. And in being Esther, people like her. Esther 2:15. And most importantly, the king likes her. Verse 17. Now, during this time, Esther did not tell anybody that she was a Jew. No reason not to. No stigma at this point. She just doesn't get around to it. It doesn't seem important to her. And now, at the same time that she becomes queen, her older relative who adopted her, Mordecai, you remember what happens with him? he uncovers an assassination plot. And after uncovering that, he happens to overhear it. He happens to be in the place where he can overhear it. He tells Esther, and she tells Xerxes that Mordecai has found out the plot. But we later learn that the king does nothing to reward him and to make sure that he is properly honored for the salvation of the king. And so after that, we read and we find that there's a vain and wicked man by the name of Haman who is promoted to a very powerful office in the kingdom of the Medo-Persians. Everybody in the world bows down to Haman except who? Mordecai. And this enrages Haman so much so that he goes to the king and he tricks him. And when he finds out that Mordecai's a Jew, he gets the king to sign a decree that says all the Jews in all the provinces are to die. And Xerxes signs that. Now, I want you to remember that Xerxes does not know at this time that his wife, Queen Esther, is one of those Jews that he has just signed the death warrant for. And so he signs a decree. It's going to annihilate all the Jews and seize their possessions as plunder. Mordecai learns of the plot. He tells Esther, who has to risk her life in order to approach the king. She never knows. No one does going into the presence of the king. If the scepter's not held up, then she will die. But he happens to be in a very good mood that day. And as a result of this, he offers her up to the half of the kingdom. What does she ask for? She asks for a banquet at which the king and Haman can be present. Haman, puffed up, him being who he is, thinks, man, this is great for me. I'm on top of the world. He goes out and he runs into Mordecai. And what happens? Mordecai doesn't bow to him. He's enraged. He goes home and he tells his wife, what's the plan? Build a gallows 50 cubits high, so high it can be seen from anywhere, and go in and ask the king in the morning if you can take Mordecai's life, hang him on those gallows. Guess what? Xerxes can't sleep that night. And so in order to help him sleep, he has the annals of the history of his kingdom read to him. And it so happens that the portion that was read in that evening was what Mordecai had done for the king. And he says, has anything been done in order to reward him for the thing that he's done? No, nothing's been done. So here is Haman on his way in to ask the king to take Mordecai's life. And the king says, what should I do to the man whom I desire to honor so much? What does Haman think? Got to be me. But it's not. It's Mordecai. He has to lead him and guide him. The tables turn. And as the result of this, Haman loses his life. Mordecai and Esther are able to flip the script. And they have a complete revenge on their enemies. No miracles in that. But every providential step can be seen looking back. And all I would say to you is, God's working that way in our lives. And perhaps with the benefit of eternity, we can see all of that. All right, thanks guys for your attention this morning.